Sups, everybody! I am Mr. Sups, and we are back with more homework for the evolution of video games. Alright, this is going to be a bit more serious and offbeat than my usual homework videos. Usually, it's a recap for those not in the class, recapping the historical goings-on about the evolution of video games, and then a response to a question posed by my professor based around an element that we recently discussed. But here, it's different. Here, I'm not just recapping more widely available history about the more technical and economic evolution of things, such as when certain games came out, or certain technology became more widely available, and how that changed the market and industry. Here, I'm recapping an actual lecture. That's not a very good statement to make, but you get my point. Sorry, Professor. But this week we talked about the more specific psychological elements and the consequences of the evolutions that happened. Hence why I'm using Psychonauts. Although my Let's Play of that is coming out Monday. Shameless plug. As such, I felt like I would be doing a disservice to this class to boil all that-ness down to 8, maybe 12 minutes or longer. Let's see how this goes. But I have my professor's blessing, and I would encourage all those able to take a class like this if you can. So without further ado, on to the recap. In a previous video, I talked about a government court hearing in '93 where games came under scrutiny for corrupting the youth and all that gobbledygook. But it turns out that they may have had a point. As one of the experts called by the government said, we need to study this more. And here we're discussing the fruits of that studies. In that hearing, the game Night Trap was called out for being too adult for kids. But here we examined its place on the scale of, quote, simulated versus actual reality. At its core, the issue is very similar to the concept of the uncanny valley, which, when you boil that concept down, along with the others that are going to be boiled down here, it's the zone between realism and stylization that makes subjects feel off. While games like Night Trap and Mortal Kombat were called out for being pornos and snuff films, they weren't the first games to really do stuff like that. There was things like Custer's Revenge and Wolfenstein. But they were the first games to use live-action performances to do that, which put them squarely in the uncanny valley. This caused many people to look at the games indexically, like if they actually happened. Not to say that they were mistaken or anything, but kind of like how you would watch a movie and you're convinced this is happening type of thing. Because we have an actual reference of what things like this look and feel like because we are human beings. We have seen that. But other games have a more perceptual edge, where we don't really have a reference for it, but it simulates reality. The best way to kind of look at it, because it's kind of highbrow terms, it's Indexical is more realistic, while perceptual is more stylized. But now here's where we get into a little core theme about the class, is that when technology advances, it always trends towards realism. A good example of that is The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Like, specifically the opening scene, to kind of show you what I'm talking about. In the previous Zelda games, the action took place on a 2D plane with super-deformed characters, and many of their actions were similarly stylized. Swordplay was just swinging the sword. There was no, like, great sweeping movements or anything. But here in the opening of Ocarina of Time, you can really see how it becomes more realistic. There's cycles of day and night, dust is scattered with every hoofbeat, the camera pans and changes its view, rather than just staying to the static top-down view of Link to the Past. Now, there are other better examples, but here's just a good one that we went over and scrutinized in class. So, in the 90s, as we kept trending towards that realism, that indexical edge, we started digging ourselves deeper and deeper into the uncanny valley, until we started to trend towards a different angle, the one of hyper-realism, as our professor called it. To illustrate this point, the professor showed us a video of a sort of behind-the-scenes thing in The Last of Us, where they were doing a scene for live-action reference via motion capture and all of that, of intense emotional thing that kind of evolved into a Mexican standoff. And they were saying how they did multiple takes of how it was playing out realistically, and then the director had the actors sing their lines. The movements that they were doing when they were singing were so overly dramatic in our eyes, looking at it as people, but then they also had footage of the scene playing out like it would. And that overly dramatic movement translated into more realistic movement when it was all animated and put together. I'll put a link in the description for that video if you want to see what I'm talking about, but be warned, there'll be spoilers. But as the industry was getting that all situated and together, many scientists were doing all that studying that they said had to be done. And then we discussed things like how the human mind interacts with games. And that is just a whole different can of worms to get into. If you want to investigate this further, look up Sherry Turkle and Edward Castronova, because their theories are fascinating, and these following paragraphs will boil their theories down to the point that they become a watery gruel. So to put it simply, video games are not a mindless entertainment, as they require more brain power and focus than really any other medium. They are more active experiences, interactive, as opposed to the more passive ones of movies and music and books. There is a feeling of extension and action in them that you cannot get anywhere else. As Sherry Turkle puts it, in pinball, you act on the ball. In Pac-Man, you are the mouth. You see this reaction in players of things like, "He killed me," or "I beat you." Kind of like how you're in a car, the car becomes an extension of yourself. And when you get into a fender bender, the reaction is, "He hit me," not "his car hit my car." And in this sort of headspace, games truly are a meeting of the minds between the player and the creator, where you as the player are competing with and trying to overcome the creator's challenge. But both of you are limited in some way by the games you are playing. You can only jump if the creator allows you to jump, and only to the extent that the creator allows you to jump. And even then, that really depends on the type of game. And even then, the jumping, no matter what it is, you might have more or less experience in aptitude in the game, or even less experience in the game, but you can only do what the game allows you to do. But then there are the creators who are trying to, quote-unquote, beat the player. But only within the rules they set for themselves to make it a fair fight. Because they're the creator, they can make it so that you never win, and you always lose. That the only way for you to progress is by a jump that you physically cannot make in that game. But that would make it against the rules of games. So they make it so you can, but it will have to be difficult. And that's the thing about games, that they are strictly rule-governed. Everything must conform to those rules, and even if you fail 100 times, you can still succeed. And here's where the lecture got heavier, somehow, because as anyone who has gone to school or had a job and whatnot can tell you, that's not the way life works. Sometimes there are no second chances or extra lives. Sometimes you will fail and there is or was nothing you can do about it. Sad. While the 93 hearings, they were worried that games was going to corrupt people to make them murderers and rapists. In class, we discussed the very real possibility that because of that heavy statement, people may succumb to depression because that is not reality. Our professor even shared a news article about how a thankfully small number of people committed suicide after the release of James Cameron's Avatar, because that beautiful world of Pandora will never be a reality in their eyes. But that's the thing about games. Pandora can be a reality, and you can explore it. And again, there is a possibility that through that, people may become addicted to games. Which leads me to the discussion. The DSM-5, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, edition number 5, had an entry on video game addiction, which read, needs more research. And that's what we were asked to discuss, whether it should or should not be included in the DSM-6, and I was asked to be on the side of not. While I do agree that there are those obsessed with something, does that qualify as an addiction? As with many things, addiction has many definitions, and while colloquially it may be synonymous with obsession, medically it is not. For our purposes, addiction is characterized by inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavioral control, craving, diminished recognition of significant problems with one's behaviors and interpersonal relationships, and dysfunctional emotional response. Like other chronic diseases, addiction often involves cycles of relapse and remission. Without treatment or engagement in recovery activities, addiction is progressive and can result in disability or premature death. So to recap, addiction is the condition where the absence of a substance affects your brain negatively, and so you use what you're addicted to an unhealthy degree, sometimes to the point of death. And here is the sticking point for death by game stories. Those stories sensationalize it to the extreme, and the issue is not at all bad as it make it out to be. You see these stories about some kid in Korea played games until his organs quit, but more people die in Korea to fans, like actual air-moving, blades-moving fans, than due to video game-induced exhaustion. And then there are those who point to those who are obsessed to the point of neglecting things like school, work, and human interaction, and call that addiction, which when you look at it really isn't. As I said, obsession is not addiction, and that addiction is a disease. This type of behavior is not disease, but a symptom of something else. And when they do delve that deep into games, it's often due to something pre-existing. And they find that escape in games, like what we said in the lecture. And even if that qualifies, is that any worse than the addiction to things like alcohol and other substances? Which people without any prior baggage can get addicted to that stuff and even die because they drink or snort or smoke too much. The definition I used for addiction puts great emphasis on the withdrawal factors. While withdrawal factors for things like alcohol and cocaine, stuff like that, it's very physical. But with games, it's